everyone. I'm Congressman Darren Soto, and I'm here with one of our famous Tuskegee Airmen, Mr. Richard Hall of Winter Park and Maitland here in Central Florida. And we're going to be doing an interview for our Library of Congress series on World War II. First of all, Mr. Hall, I just want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your service and what you've done to help make this country a safe and wonderful place. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you.
We want to start out with just a little background. So you initially came to Winter Park as a young boy, is that correct?
Yes, I was 5 months old. My folks brought me to Winter Park.
And then you grew up around here and went to what school in Central Florida?
I went to Winter Park Elementary first in Winter Park, and then I went to Hungerford, Robert Hungerford boarding school, which is located in Eatonville, Florida.
Sure. And what was the year that you entered into Hungerford about?
Must have been 1938.
And did you participate in any particular sports or clubs or anything of that nature?
Yes, I played football, basketball, and I ran track.
So you were quite the athlete.
That's why my legs are going now.
Well, you still seem to be moving around just fine, Mr. Hall. And then from there you went on to additional education, is that correct?
Yes, that's graduated from Hungerford. Then I received a 4-year athletic scholarship at Xavier University in New Orleans.
Wonderful. And how was your experience at Xavier?
Well, Xavier being a Catholic school, I first learned the Hail Marys and Apostle Creed.
It was pretty strict, huh?
Very strict.
But at some point your college education got cut short, right? You were drafted, is that correct?
Well, what happened when the draft was, when I first went to college, the draft was 21 to 31. The same year that I went to college, the draft went from 18 to 45. And I just turned 18. So the Catholic sister said, "Now, Mr. Hall, if you join the reserves, then we keep you, protect you from the draft." Well, it sounded kind of good to me. So I joined the reserves. Well, I was in the reserves by a year and I got called active duty.
And what were you feeling at that point when you got the call to active duty?
Well, I wanted to stay in school, but I had no other choice.
And where did you end up going to boot camp?
Well, let's see. Went to Aberdeen, Maryland Proving Grounds first.
And what was that like?
Well, it was terrible. You had to go on a rifle range and qualify with a rifle. And the range is off the coast of Delaware. And it was cold. No. And we slept in pup tents. And the idea is you would stay there until you qualified. And so using that M1 rifle, most kids, their shoulders were knocked out of place because it kicks.
Sure.
So I put a pad on my shoulder. So I qualified the first day.
You qualified the first day? How long did some of your peers take to qualify?
Oh, a couple of weeks.
So did you share with them about having the pad on your shoulder as a big help?
Oh, of course. Of course.
And from there, after you qualified, what happened next?
After then, we got transferred to the Beale Air Force Base in California. On additional training.
And did they just tell you were going to go to Air Force training, or did you get to pick that?
No. In those days, you didn't pick anything.
Of course. So, had you ever had any experience with aircraft before you got picked to go out to California?
No.
So, what did you think when you knew you were going to be working with airplanes then?
Well, I was happy. Because I figured that it'd always be inside of a hangar, be warm.
Sure.
At that time, that's what I saw, but I found out different.
Sure. Did you have any mechanical experience before that time?
Only with cars. My dad always tinkered with engines, and I'd watch him. I knew what valves were, rings, piston heads, and stuff.
Sure. And so when you got to California, did you go through a training program, or
Well,
what happened at that point?
Everything's training.
And did you find airplanes to be a little more complicated than cars, or did you pick it up quickly?
Yeah, I picked it up very quickly because at that time, see the P-40, that engine is just like a car, only has 12 cylinders. Only difference.
And at this point, when you're out in California, was the Tuskegee Airmen program already in existence, or was that still going to happen in the future?
Something in the future, I guess. Yeah, at that point.
Sure. And so, how long did you spend out in California?
Yeah, that course was about 3 months, I guess.
And that was around 1940,
Maybe 42,
42.
43. Because I went overseas in 43.
And then, so from California, you ended up going overseas then?
Yeah.
And where did you end up going from there?
A place called Cherbourg, France.
And what was the travel like going from California over to France?
Well, to me it was exciting because I never traveled that long distance before.
Sure. And were you and your peers scared, excited?
I was really excited, I think, at that time.
And
I was too young to be afraid, I guess.
sure. And what was your first impression of France when you arrived there?
The language. But I learned to speak a little French.
You did?
Yeah.
And where were you stationed when you were in France? Was there a particular base?
Cherbourg,
Cherbourg.
France. It's just outside of Paris. It's just south of Paris.
Do you remember how far away from the front you all were?
Although at that time, the Germans, the Germans were still up in the northern part of France at that time, see, and also in Germany. So Cherbourg was only about, that's not too far from, I have to look at the maps.
So you were pretty close.
Yeah.
And what work did you do at Cherbourg?
Aircraft maintenance. Try to keep them flying. They come back all banged up, We try to patch the holes and get it back online again.
So what type of banged up type of issues would you have to fix on some of these planes?
Well, most of the time, if you got hit in the engine, got a slug in the engine, you could probably pull that slug out and patch it. If sometimes so bad you couldn't, you might as well ditch the whole thing.
And so you'd have to figure out which planes were fixable and which ones.
Oh yeah, you had an LCP. This aircraft in our commission, so we have board in operations. They show by serial number every morning what number the aircraft was in by serial number, was in commission or out of commission, and if it was out of commission, why, and then estimated time of it.
And what type of planes did you normally work with when you were there?
P-40.
So was P-40
at that time P-40.
throughout the most of the war?
Well, we got the P-40, the P-47 later on, and this supposed to be a much faster airplane, and they had with the cylinders on like this. The P-40 is just like a car, only had 12 cylinders.
Sure, and so that gave you a familiarity. What were the pilots like that you engaged with, and how did they interact with a lot of the engineers and other repairmen?
Want to be sure this thing gonna bring it back home.
I'm sure. So there was a close relationship between you all.
Of course.
And do you recall any particular story of barely getting back to the airfield that sticks in your memory?
Like then we had one came back and he pretty well shut up. And so operation told me to land in it was a lake not too far. Put it down in that lake, and then we probably see him. So.
And then at this point, did they start bringing over some of the Tuskegee Airmen over? Were they finished training? At what point did that happen in the war?
But I don't see, they were already overseas when I came in.
So you got there and they were already there.
Yeah.
And what was your impression of some of the pilots you worked with from Tuskegee?
I thought they were outstanding. There were a lot of kills and a good record.
And was there a point of pride with these being the first African Americans in a air unit serving in our country?
Oh yes, very proud.
And what did it feel like having grow up in Florida and now you're in France and you all are flying these amazing aircraft and fixing everything? Did it open your eyes a lot more to the world and to, I mean, what was that feeling like?
Oh yeah, it did. In my case, you see, after the war was over, I was assigned to a mobile train unit. If she knew that, folks listening don't know it. And it was set up with a bunch of attachments. Each attachment had crew members on it that represented every system in the airplane. I think what happened, somebody in Washington said, hey, you know, we got a lot of old airplanes. They're parked down in Texas, the wingtip was dry. Figured it would last long. Well, some parks in Arizona. We made a lot of airplanes during World War II.
Sure.
So after the war was over, what they decided to do? Park them down in Texas and Arizona. Wingtip to wingtip. Some with the tires on and so on. So I guess, what's been, I guess in the first 50s, somebody in Washington says, what should we do to these old airplanes? I said, but you know, we got a lot of friends who could use these.
Sure.
At that time, everybody was our friend.
Sure.
We had no enemies other than the Germans and the Japanese.
Sure.
So they formed these mobile train detachments. And that job was to teach the people how to maintain them. Then the pilots would go in and teach them how to fly them. So.
And
now we went to I had no idea so many countries in South America.
There are many.
I had no idea, you know. Growing up in Florida, that's from Mexico to South America.
And I'm sure from all the wartime training, you had a lot of things to teach them. How long were you in France for?
Oh, I was in France about less than a year, just because the war was over. Yeah.
And do you remember any particular pilots, Tuskegee Airmen pilots, that stuck out in your mind for one way or another that you interacted with?
Well, there's 2 or 3. McGee was one.
How was McGee like?
Well, he was a good pilot. We had some other problems, so.
Yeah, I'm sure
John knows about those.
some of these folks were probably very proud. They were making history and defending our country, right?
Oh yeah, oh definitely.
What were some of the other pilots you recall?
Now let's see. One friend of mine, he was shot down and taken as a prisoner of war.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. McCreary was the name.
McCreary.
Yeah. And I think he only had a few missions and got shot down over Germany. And so he survived. In fact, when I came up for retirement, he went for the state of Ohio. And he called one day and said, "Oh, I'm staying coming up for retirement." I said, "Yes? What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to Florida. I've been trying to get to Florida for the last 30 years.
And finally got back.
No, he said, "Oh, come on down and take a day down. Get a job at the state. You're too young to go down to Florida, get fat, and die early."
Well, we know neither of those things happen.
And so that's what it did.
And what was your feeling when the war was over with Germany? What were you? How did you find out? What were you feeling at the time?
Then it was just loaded off of my mind, you know. But I was concerned about getting back to see my parents, my family.
And so, when the war ends, what happened? What happens next? You end up going back to the United States.
Oh yeah, I came back to the United States.
And did you feel like changed at all, having lived in Europe and gone to California? What was that experience like coming back to the stateside after being in France?
Well, I didn't want to go back to France, and I didn't go back to California. I wanted to come to Florida.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then from there, you ended up working where at in the States when you got back?
Well, when I came back, I stayed in the service.
Sure.
Yeah. But I tried to get back to Xavier, and they said, well, we'll put you on the list, sir. But me not being non-Catholic, I figured that I wouldn't have a high priority on that list.
So it was a major sacrifice for you, having gone to Xavier on a scholarship for athletics and then getting drafted and going to serve our country in a historic fashion, but coming back and not having that opportunity.
Well, I survived.
Of course. And what did you end up doing back in the States with the Airmen after that?
Oh, well, when I retired in the Air Force, I'll tell you about McCrae, who worked for the state. In fact, he was deputy, you know, like states are set up, member of the cabinet and so on.
Incredible.
So he called me one day and says, what I was going to do. I says, I'm going to Florida. You know. And he said, oh no, you're too young to go down to Florida and get fat and die. Could just be sitting around. And so he gave me a job with State of Ohio. He said, come on, I'll take you down.
Sure.
So they gave me a state credit card and a state car. And I was in charge of quality control.
That's
State of
wonderful.
Ohio, yeah.
And you must have had a wealth of experience by then.
Oh yeah.
And just to discuss a little bit about how did you find yourself going to Korea next after World War II had concluded?
I'm gonna tell you what, I was on Okinawa at the time, and my wife's supposed to travel on the 1st of June. My wife and baby.
Oh my gosh.
1st of June, so the colonel came by, Colonel Weapons came by. I got a house, I was waiting on my wife to travel. I plant flowers in the yard. They made me some bamboo furniture and something. And so Colonel Weapons came by one day and said, oh, when the last time you qualified on the rifle range? And I said, Colonel, we qualified together. You know, I wouldn't know what he asked. He knew when I qualified.
Sure.
He says, come on, get in the Jeep. He had a Jeep also. We'll go to the rifle range and draw a weapon, a couple weapons and power for you. And while we were over there, he said, you know, a little country up north decided to fight among themselves. I said, what country? He said, Korea. Well, I know Korea was further north, you know. I'm on Okinawa, see?
Sure.
And I said, Colonel, you know, my wife's coming on the 1st of June, the 1st of July. He said, well, her orders have been canceled, so she knew about the war before I did. I'm in the theater.
And so, what year was that where you were in Okinawa?
I went on 49, it's in the war broke out in 50.
And then, that was about the time, how long did you stay in Okinawa before you left for Korea?
It was September, and I went to Korea that next year in August. No, it was it was September.
Sure.
Because we had some uniforms on down Okinawa. It's hot, just
Sure.
like Florida. It was Korea, about to freeze. I did a stupid thing in Korea.
Oh yeah, what was that?
Well, see, it was, the colonel said, find some place for your platoons in. So I found an old schoolhouse. It didn't have no top in it, see, but it had a flatbed stove in the middle. And we had some clothes on.
Sure.
So the guys started pulling off ceiling the walls off the sides of the building, and the building fire in the stove. No top. Good target for anybody flying over it now. The colonel told us that they come over at least once a night and drop one bomb. They never hit nothing. See? So I think they threw it out of the window.
Unbelievable. And what was your first impression of Korea when you got there?
Try to survive. But
Sure.
at that time, that's the only thing that was on my mind. Back to Winnipeg.
Sure. And what was your rank by that time?
That's a master sergeant.
And how many folks were in your unit?
First fighter. Yeah, about 3,000. I guess all that.
So it was quite a large group of
But I
folks.
just had one. I just had one squadron.
And how many
First
people were in
sergeant,
your,
one squadron.
and how many people were in your squadron?
Well, it varied. Let's see, 12 to the squad, 3 times 12 beats about 40, about 50, 40, 50.
And by then, had the Army been integrated, or was it still?
Yeah, but it integrated that time.
At what point was that around that you?
Well, see, when it broke up, the Tuskeegee Airmen, that's when they integrated.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that was around when you were in Okinawa, or a little
Oh,
before
no, that happened before.
Okay. And
Because, see, they integrated in 49.
sure,
I mean, that's when the law came out.
of course,
Now, it took the Army a little while to do it,
of course.
but the Air Force did it right away.
So you're in Korea, in charge of a integrated group of men.
Yeah, black
Did-
and white.
Was that? Did everybody respect you right away, or were there difficulties?
Well, it's the way you carry yourself, you know.
Sure,
So you demand this respect.
sure.
Then you get it.
Well, I'm sure being a
And
veteran.
you do it with a smile.
Sure, of course, and I'm sure being a veteran of one major war already, there were probably some people who were pretty new there, right?
Oh,
And what type
they're
of
coming in, you know. Well, they guys in my squadron only had 4 or 5 months in service.
and were you all still fixing airplanes over there? Or, and what planes were you all working with in Korea?
Oh, we had a night fighter, and B-25.
And did you see those planes take as much fire as in World War II, or was it a little different?
I think Korea, you can't compare Korea, I think, with World War II.
Sure,
Two different, that's just a little firefight, they call it. Korea.
Sure. So it was for you it was a much smaller scale than what you had seen in
Right,
France. Did the planes take a lot less fire then than they did in World War II?
I would say that, yeah, it would be less in Korea. Because in Germany, right there, they had, so I'm thinking of that one airplane. See, when you get young, like, when your memory gets really short.
Well, you've been doing a great job, Mr. Hall. I realize a lot of this stuff has taken place 50, 60 plus years ago, 7 years
Like
ago.
70
So
years ago.
it feels like yesterday hearing you talk about it now. And how long were you in Korea for?
Well, let's see, from September, oh yeah, but I ran out of Korea, you know about that, right?
Sure.
No. Well, I was in part of that outfit that came back to Japan.
So you were there when we had to leave, and then we had to come back.
Right, but I would know when I came back. I had a choice. I had to have I had so many points. My wife and daughter could come to Japan, or I could go home. Now, I'm still flying up to Korea every other day. So I thought about it. No, I'm going home. So
Sure.
with that choice.
And I'm sure that was what your wife's preference was, right?
Of course.
And so when you came back, is that when you found yourself in Ohio, or did you come back to Florida at that time?
Well, I never got to fly until I retired.
Yeah, that's what I figured, but I'm
On
asking.
vacation.
So what state were you at next? when
Oh,
you
the
came
next state, listen, when I left Korea, I went to a nice little place, Grand Falls, North Dakota.
A nice,
Nice and
sunny, warm
warm.
spot, right? And what did
I kept saying, I'm from Florida.
and what did they have you doing in Grand Falls?
Same thing, aircraft maintenance.
And what were the types of planes that were over there?
Well, let's see what we have. We have a lot of little everything. Also, we have missiles, see, in North Dakota, on the ground missiles, and they're all pointed toward Russia.
Sure. So
They
those
were
were
highly classified at one time. That's not anymore.
yes, and we won't make you talk too much about it, but I'm sure you were in. Did you already kind of feel at that time that there was a Cold War rivalry starting between Russia and the United States?
You know, we would be real there for most civilians. You know what I'm saying? Well,
Sure. And you might have recalled when, after the war ended in Germany, the United States dropped the two nuclear bombs on Japan.
yeah.
What was that like when you heard about that?
That was terrible. Because once while I was stationed in Japan, when we ran out of Korea, I had a secretary, and she had a burnt on the side of her face, and said she was 20 miles from ground zero when they dropped the bomb.
Sure.
And so they hired people who were affected by the bomb. They got priority,
Sure.
you know. And so the secretary that I hired, she decided her face of this job. It's a long way from ground zero, so that was quite a bomb.
Sure. And I'm sure you interacted sometimes with Marines and Navy men who might have had to continue to fight if that war in the Pacific didn't end. Well, what was sort of the interaction when you met with some of them in Korea and after World War II?
After World War II, well, the only ones I met was the ones Tuskeegee Airmen.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then after you came back to North Dakota, how long were you there for?
Let's see, I was only there about a year, one season.
Sure.
They call it one season.
Sure. And then where did they send you to next?
Well, from North Dakota, I was sent back to Columbus, Ohio. It changed the name of that base now.
And that was Mr. McCrory who brought you back there?
No, he was already there.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
And I found out he was there, and he found where I was, and then that's when he offered me a job.
what was it like when you got to see him for the first time since probably when he took off before he was taken
He was
capture?
wrong. Because I had heard he was dead, see. I knew he was a POW.
Sure.
And he's alive.
So when you meet him, what do you guys talk
We just
about?
talk about everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Talk about his family, and I talk about my family because we're both singles.
Sure.
Yeah.
And did you talk about his experience in Germany, or was that something that you just wouldn't talk about?
Didn't talk about because I know he had a rough time.
Sure.
Because he must have been in that prison camp for about 2 years.
Sure.
But he's the type of guy that could survive. You know?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, and it appears that our military recognized that by promoting him after that.
Yeah.
And then, how long did you stay in Ohio for?
Well, the second time,
Yeah,
till I got a job at the state of Ohio.
sure. And we had talked briefly earlier that you were also involved in the Vietnam War. What was your role in that?
Aircraft maintenance.
Yeah. Did you go over to Vietnam?
Yeah.
And when did you end up going over?
Well, let's see. When I go to Vietnam,
What was it, early 60s or mid 60s?
let's see, 62, 63.
So you were there early. And
So I was stationed at Thompson
and where were you stationed at?
Road. At Thompson Road.
And
This Saigon.
sure. And what was that like being over in Saigon?
Well, the first day I got when I got off the airplane, and this is where the barracks, NCO barracks from? They said, well, we don't have any. And I said, where do we sleep? You go out that gate over there. You'd see a sand lot, and they'll take it downtown to the hotel. And so about 5 of us got together, so we're going to stay together, you know.
Sure.
Because being in a hotel in the country like that, never know what's going to happen. You know?
Sure.
Yeah.
And
we all had weapons, so we kept our weapons close to us.
sure.
That first night in the hotel was something. And then the next night, it was still, you know, on edges.
Sure. And how long were you in Saigon for?
Let's see, a year.
What type of planes did you all work with over there?
Well, at that time I was taking care of the AOCP board, that's Aircraft and Commission, you know, for the entire 2nd Air Division. I was rowing boats about as long from here to there. Yeah.
And what was your rank by that time?
I was on that side of it. Yeah.
And how many folks did you have working under you?
At that time, about 15.
So they must have, you're now a veteran of 2 wars, you're going into a 3rd. They must have had a great deal of respect, or at least had a lot of questions for you, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
And when you found yourself going back to Vietnam, was it like exciting, or were you like, how do I find myself back to a 3rd war?
This like we're going over to a war.
Right.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
We're going to Korea.
And now, with you being there that early, were you there when they had to leave the Hanoi Hotel?
Hanoi Hotel.
Or when we had to leave Saigon and then end up coming back?
That must have happened after I left.
When did you leave Vietnam?
Let's see. I think.
You were there about a year, right?
Yeah, at Vietnam, yeah.
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 And then you moved back to Ohio after that?
Our next move was back to Lockburn Air Force Base in Ohio.
Sure. And
No, North Dakota.
oh, back to North Dakota.
At that time, in North Dakota. So many trips.
Sure. I'm just amazed that you have such clarity in all these things, and we appreciate it. So you go back to North Dakota, and then you end up working in Ohio again for a while, right?
Right, I came back to Ohio after North Dakota.
And how long were you in Ohio before you finally got back to Florida?
Well, about a year, I guess.
And then you get back?
No, you see, I went to work for the state of Ohio.
Sure.
After I retired from the Air Force.
And what year did you retire from the Air Force?
Let's look on my certificate.
Oh, so it was the 70s or 60s?
I don't know, 70s, I guess.
Yeah, 70s, okay.
60s.
Yeah, there's no quiz here. We're just getting a timeline together. What'd you end up doing for the state of Ohio?
What did I do?
Yeah.
I had the Quality Control Division for the state of Ohio.
Sure.
We wrote contracts for the entire state for all items that was used by all state agencies, including 22 state hospitals, 9 prisons, and 2 reformatory schools.
And now when you're back in civilian life, were you able to reconnect with some of your peers from the Tuskegee Airmen or from Korea or from Vietnam?
Oh, the only one I met was Walter McCreary. He's
Sure.
the one that got me this job.
And I had read in our local paper that you all had a group that you kept track of with each other. Were they all over the country?
Yeah, they're scattered now all over the country.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then you finally get back to Florida around when?
Let's see, what year did I come back to Florida?
Was it 70s still or the 80s?
No, 80s. In the 80s.
What a journey it must have felt like, right? You had kind of literally around the world and back to Florida again.
It was a mobile training outfit. We had detachments all over the country, complete around the globe.
And how many children did you ultimately have with your wife?
I had 3 altogether, but 2 boys died at childbirth.
And
Just had a daughter That,
And eventually, over the course of the 80s and 90s, I know there was a lot of re-examination of, some of these groups like the Tuskegee Airmen and eventually the Buccaneers, about just the amazing role in history where you all were trailblazers, pioneers, and do you feel that the success of the Tuskegee Airmen and then afterwards was one of the big factors of integration and the prominence of many African Americans in the military after that?
well, I think we made a dent in the society.
Sure.
Uh,
And so, continue.
it was a long journey.
Sure.
When I stopped at San Diego. I'm a youngster. At 92.
Sure. No, you eventually hear that the Tuskegee Airmen are getting the Medal of Honor. How did you hear about that, and what happened next?
Oh, when we got Congressional Gold Medal?
Yes.
Well, they've been working on it for some time.
Sure.
Here's things from time to time. All at once it happened.
And did you hear it in the news? Did you get a letter?
Yeah, that was a medal. Just out there in the dining room.
And what did you feel when first of all, did they send it to you, or did you go get it in a ceremony?
No, President Bush gave it to us.
So you went to the White House then?
Yeah.
And what was it like at the White House?
Oh, outstanding.
And what were you feeling at that time when you get this prestigious medal?
Well, I felt grateful. I said to myself, it took me a long time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Many years.
Yeah.
And then you ultimately now retired here to Maitland, Florida, right by your childhood home in Winter Park. And when you look back on this long career and all the places you've been, and you come back to Florida, what's your reflection on that? Like, how would you describe your journey?
Well, the first time after World War II, when I came home, I got off the train, and a guy by the name of Roy Ayers, he was one of the producers down there. And see, when we're coming out of New York and got down to Virginia, the police came through and he made a statement that all you boys move forward. And see, I knew some guys had weapons.
Sure.
When he made that statement, I could hear the clicks, and see, a lot of them had overcoats on. And there's a few guys in there that blew that guy away,
Sure.
And after he walked through, the conductor, the police walked through first and said, "Oh, you boys move forward." And nobody moved.
Sure.
I heard the clicks on those overcoats.
Sure. And
anyway, when we got further down in Virginia, then the police came aboard. You know how they come through, walk through.
Sure.
And he just looked and walked on out.
Sure.
I think he got the message then.
Sure. Well, you all
because the guy sitting
you all had served our country, defended us in World War II, and I would imagine you're not going to come back here and be. So you think things weren't the same afterwards? There's like a emboldened feeling that things had to change, right?
Yeah. You see, a bunch of guys on there had been infantry, not Air Force. There was a lot of infantry and people out there. And one guy said, "You know what? I've been killing white folks for the last 4 years. There's one more making a difference."
Right. And they were, and they. They had earned their place in history.
Yeah, I didn't want anything to happen because I want to get home. So
sure.
I knew if it had been an incident, I'd be hopeful of questioning and all this other stuff.
So you had that homecoming. What was it like for the last one, when you finally get down here for good?
Oh, outstanding. I had, incidentally, when you put in for retirement, you'd be surprised to know you get letters and pictures of houses all over.
Sure.
And I got a phone call, where you going to retire? I said, Central Florida. I got all kind of pictures from Central Florida.
Sure.
Down below Alana, below Center, that was all swamp when I was growing up. So,
Oh yeah, part of our district now.
What it looks like now.
Well, it must have been great. So you picked a house in Maitland eventually, or
Yeah, and it was listen.
yeah.
But I was showing quite too. Yeah.
Well, it's a beautiful home, and
Well, thank you.
I just want to take a moment, Mr. Hall, to just thank you for this opportunity to be able to interview you about your experience, your journey, your clarity, your role in history to make this country what it is today. We're just so very grateful for your contributions, your sacrifices,
No.
and your service to our country. You are, even though you'll probably not accept me saying it, a real, true American hero, and we're so very grateful for what you've done for both folks that you grew up with and so many generations after you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hall.
No, thank you. Thank you. See that Pavlova? You want to take a look at it?
Sure. We'll cut the interview.